This valley has heard that tune before. It is a marching tune from George Washington's army. It emanated from fifes and drums leading soldiers on these roads, both sides of the river. This mighty Hudson River that saw so much history. The Hudson River was had a pivotal role in the Revolutionary War. And today, we will bring it all back with song and story. Marching wasn't the only kind of music that helped the war along. There were broadsides, which told you the latest news, and there's lots of news as things heat up with England. 1775, the British have put more taxes on the tea, and they've taken away our fishing rights in the North Atlantic. We're being told where we can fish and where we can't. And an angry young man in Boston writes this broadside calling for immediate independence and any Englishman who gets in the way to be hanged from the Liberty Tree. What a court hath old England of folly and sin, spite of Chatham and Camden, Burkeberry, Wilkes and Glyn, not content with the Game Act, the tax fish and sea, and America drenched with hot water and tea. Derry down, 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 Derry down. There's no telling where this oppression may stop. Some swear there's no cure but a capital chop. And then I'm sure each American's wish to be drenched in the tea and to bribe them a fish. Derry down, 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 Derry down. 3 generals, these mandates born across the sea to deprive them of fish and to make them drink tea. In turn, sure, these free men will boldly agree to give them a dance upon Liberty Tree. Derry down, 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 Derry down. Then freedom's the word, both at home and abroad. Doubt every scabbard that hides a good sword. Our forefathers gave us a freedom in hand and would die in defense of the rights of our land. Derry down, 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 Derry down. And that would have emanated from the taverns where they were talking about the politics of the moment and how the war was going. The instrument, by the way, is a guitar shaped like a lute, which was sort of a transitional instrument. The lutes were popular here in the earliest days, and then guitars came along. Well, the British and the Americans both saw the importance of this Hudson River. And the British knew if they could get control of it, they could win. They just needed control of the Hudson to cut off the New England colonies from the southern colonies. Divide and conquer, and they had us. But we were ready. We knew they wanted to do that. So one of the earliest things we did was forge that giant chain that we put across the river from West Point to the other side to waylay British ships. Well, the war has begun, and soldiers are marching away, and the women are left to wonder and worry and lament. And one of my favorites of those songs originally came from Ireland with the French and Indian War, came here filled with Gaelic. But we of the Hudson Valley loved the tune, and we made it our own by the time of the Revolution. She's sitting alone on Buttermilk Hill. She's waiting for Johnny to come back. She sings of dyeing her dress red. A red dress is a symbol of her faithfulness. And there's lots of buttermilks in the Hudson Valley. Turns out Buttermilk Hill is in Tarrytown. Here I sit on Buttermilk Hill. Who can blame me? Cry my fill. Every tear would turn a mill. Johnny's gone for a soldier. Shul, 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 room. Shula-rack shack, shula-barbaloo. When I die for Sally Bubbling, come bibble in the moon. Shalori, I'll sell my hat, I'll sell my reel, I'll even sell my spinning wheel. Buy my love a sword of steel. Johnny's gone for a soldier. I'll dye my dress, I'll dye it red. In the streets, I'll beg for bread. God, how I wish that I were dead. Johnny's gone for a soldier. Me, oh my, I loved him so. It broke my heart to see him go. Only time can heal my woe. Johnny's gone for a soldier. Oh, my darling, oh, my love. Gone the rainbow, gone the dove. Johnny was my only love. Johnny's gone for a soldier. Shul, shul, shul-a-room. Shula-rack shack, shula-barbaloo. When I die for Sally Bubbling, come bibble in the moon. Shalori. Of course, there are forts on both sides, up and down the Hudson. One of the most strategic ones was Stony Point. It had been an American fort, and the British took it, and Washington wanted it captured again. And so he sent General Mad Anthony Wayne, who went there very dramatically, captured it. A midnight raid on July 15th, 1779. He had a hand-picked force of 1,350 men, and they made a daring ascent of the 150-foot cliff over the Hudson. And not a shot was fired. They wanted it silent. They came over with bayonets. Flooded in, the British surrendered the fort and moved downriver. We were thrilled. We have a victory. And what we often did with victories was write a song about it, a dance, a march tune, and then that march tune often became a dance tune. And so here we have Stony Point. The instrument is perfect for dancing. It is the hammered dulcimer. Came to America in the earliest times and was very popular here in the taverns for dances. Of course, as you see, it's the forerunner of the piano. Padded hammers hitting strings. This is where the piano comes from. Well, by 1780, Washington had begun to dream of putting together his forces to drive the British from New York City, which they were occupying throughout. And to help command such a force, he turned to a recent war hero, General Benedict Arnold, a hero in the Battle of Saratoga, just passed, but a disgruntled hero. He felt underappreciated. He felt undercompensated. When George Washington offered to him that he be part of this attack on Manhattan, George wrote about Arnold. His countenance changed and he appeared to be quite fallen. Instead of thanking me, never opened his mouth. I guess it wasn't to his standards. What Arnold did want, he told Washington, was command of West Point. Granted. Benedict Arnold becomes commander of West Point and immediately begins to make plans to turn it over into British hands. It was a September day like this one. They went up, the British ship, the Vulture, sailed up the Hudson. It put anchor off of Croton Point, and out steps a handsome young English officer, Major John Andre. And Andre gets the rowboat out and he rows across to Haverstraw and goes into the woods. And that is where Benedict Arnold is waiting for him in a secret meeting. So there they are in the woods, the other side of the river. And they discuss West Point and he hands him the plans of West Point. And then Andre makes his way back to the river, but Americans had fired upon the Vulture and the Vulture had gone back down river, and Andre was now alone to make his own way back to the British lines. So they do ferry him across, and he gets a horse and he comes down till he gets to Tarrytown. And there 3 officers, soldiers, ruffians, start pushing him around. He doesn't understand what's going on. And he says, please, I'm a British officer. I need to get back to my lines. And they say, a British officer, what have we here? And they searched him, and in his boot, they found the plans for West Point. Well, Andre is put in jail in Japan, and then he is hanged. And a crowd comes to watch because that's what we did in those days. Americans all, but they're standing there watching this man, and there are tears in the eyes of Americans because he is a British officer just doing his duty when the real villain, the traitor, has gotten away. And this is a song that tells us about that. Come all you brave Americans, unto me give ear. I'll sing you now a ditty, will your spirits cheer? Concerning a young gentleman who came from Tarrytown, where he met a British officer, a man of high renown. Then up spoke this young hero, John Paulding was his name. Pray tell us where you're going, sir, also whence you came. I bear the British flag, sir, up answered bold Andre. I have a pass to take me through, I have no time to stay. The others came around him and bade him to dismount. Pray tell us where you're going, sir, give us a strict account. John Paulding said, we are resolved, you shall ne'er pass by. And so the evidence did prove the prisoner a spy. He begged for his liberty, he pled for his discharge. Oftentimes he told them if they'd set him at large, of all the gold and silver he had laid up in store. And when I reach the city, I will give you 10 times more. We scorn this gold and silver you have laid up in store. Van Wert and Paulding both replied, you need not send us more. He saw that his conspiracy would soon be brought to light. He called for pen and paper, he asked it for to write. The story came to Arnold, commanding at the fort. He called it for the Vulture, he sailed it for New York, and now Arnold to New York is gone, a-fighting for his king, and left poor Major Andre on the gallows for to swing. Andre was executed, he looked both meek and mild. His face was fair and handsome, and pleasantly he smiled. It moved each eye with pity, and every heart there bled. And everyone wished him released, and Arnold in his stead. He was a man of honor, in Britain he was born, to die upon the gallows, most highly he did scorn. And now his life has reached an end, so young and blooming still. In Turpin's quiet countryside, he sleeps upon the hill. He doesn't sleep on that hill any longer. The British came back years later and took him back, and he is now as the tomb of a hero in Westminster Abbey. And the jail where he sat and waited his fate, it's a wonderful restaurant. You can get a great brunch there. It's the old 76 house in Japan. Well, that episode, The Traitor, added such a bleakness to the scene. George Washington just felt closed in with no options and things getting darker. But help is on the way. The French have decided that the Americans need more than just financial support in this alliance, and they begin to make their plans to send French troops over to assist. It can't come fast enough. The American army is bedraggled and poverty-stricken. Washington blamed the colonies, the governors. They're not giving any money support for this army. In a 1781 letter to the governors, Washington writes, "The aggravated calamities and distresses that have resulted to the soldiers from a total want of pay for nearly 12 months, the want of clothing at a severe season, and not infrequently the want of provisions, are beyond description. I give it decidedly as my opinion that it is vain to think that an army can be kept together much longer under such a variety of sufferings." Well, soldiers were indeed hungry and ragged, and they desperately needed a sense of humor, because no money is coming, but they could laugh at the situation that they're in. And that's what this song is all about. The instrument is the mountain dulcimer. It's an American folk instrument. It originated here with German settlers who missed the zithers they'd left behind in the old country. So they made their own lap string zithers. That's the dulcimer. And this song, a soldier dressed in rags, a girl sees him and she falls madly in love with him and tries to bribe him to marry her. Soldier, soldier, will you marry me? You must get 5 and drum. How can I marry such a pretty girl as you when I've got no shoes to put on? So off to the shoe shop she'd go, fast as she could run. Running back, the finest that was there, the soldier put it on. Soldier, soldier, will you marry me? You must get 5 and drum. How can I marry such a pretty girl as you when I've got no coat to put on? Off to the coat shop she'd go, fast as she could run. Running back, the finest that was there, the soldier put it on. Soldier, soldier, will you marry me with your musket, 5 and drum? How can I marry such a pretty girl as you when I've got no hat to put on. Off to the hat shop she'd go, fast as she could run. Brought him back, the finest was there. The soldier put it on. Soldier, soldier, will you marry me now with a musket, pipe and drum? How can I marry such a pretty girl as you, with a wife and 12 children at home? Yes, times don't change all that much. The dulcimer. Now, in early July 1781, Washington and the Continental Army were encamped here in Dobbs Ferry and the surrounding villages. And alongside on the east were the French forces under the command of General Rochambeau. Washington is here because the British control New York City, and from this vantage point he thought he could observe weaknesses in the British defenses and then launch an attack and drive them out. But with the French and the American armies camped close together, it gave the French officers a chance to study the Continental Army and marvel at what Washington had wrought. Baron von Closen, an aide to Rochambeau, writes this: I admire the American troops tremendously. It is incredible that soldiers composed of men of every age, even of children of 15, of whites and blacks, almost naked, unpaid, and rather poorly fed, can march so well and withstand fire so steadfastly. And Count de Clermont-Crèvecoeur roams about the American army camp, and he was stunned by its destitution. The men were without uniforms and covered with rags. Most of them were barefoot. They're all sizes, down to children who could not be over 14. There were many Negroes and mulattoes. Only artillerymen wear uniforms. Let's hear from Baron von Closen one more time in another observance. I had a chance to see the American army man for man. It was really painful to see these brave men almost naked with some trousers and little linen jackets, most of them without stockings. But would you believe it? Very cheerful and healthy in appearance. 3/4 of the Rhode Island regiment consist of Negroes. And that regiment is the most neatly dressed, the best under arms, the most precise in its maneuvers. So here we see that the war, there are many African Americans in this war, and here. And Native Americans are also here. The Oneidas, the Tuscarora, the Abenaki, the Micmac tribes all came to Rochambeau and offered their services in the struggle against the British Crown. Well, the French are also impressed by Washington's humility. One wrote, "We'd been impatient to see the hero of liberty. His dignified address, his simplicity of manners, and mild gravity surpassed our expectations and won every heart." Perhaps they would join in this tune then that had been written in 1778. It's called A Toast to Washington. And I'll play the dulcimer the traditional way with a quill. To Washington's health, fill a bumper around, for he is our glory and pride. Our arms shall in battle with conquest be crowned, whilst virtue and he's on our side. To Washington's health, loud cannon should roar, trumpets the truth should proclaim. There cannot be found, search all the world over, he's equal in virtue and fame. To Washington's health, our hero to bless, may heaven look graciously down Oh, long may he live, our hearts to possess, and freedom still call him her own. Huzzah! Washington really wanted to attack New York City, but he saw it wasn't to be, and instead agreed with Rochambeau to march south to attack Cornwallis in Virginia instead. On August 19th, the Americans were assembled for a march, and they assembled at Ashford Avenue and Route 9. And they were expecting to march south, and yet they were told, no, we're going north. And so, marching north, here's a bit of a march tune. Looks like they're going to Boston. They're not. They're going to go up and ferry across and go down the other side to Yorktown. But this is the road to Boston. The French, as they moved south, were well received everywhere they went. They were very handsome. They had very nice uniforms, as opposed to our bedraggled look. And a chaplain in the French, with the French wrote, "The Americans, whom curiosity brings by the thousands to our camp, are constantly received with good humor and festivity, and our military music, of which they are extravagantly fond, is then played for their diversion. At such times, officers, soldiers, Americans, all intermingle and dance together." And an American doctor is with our troops, and he writes, "The French troops displayed a martial and noble appearance. Their band of music, of which the timbrel is part, is a delightful novelty." Well, the timbrel is the tambourine. And the reason it's a novelty, there is no army in the world at this time that plays tambourine as they march. The French do. And so, I'm going to play you a little French march. It's called the French Quick March. But I won't be able to hold the tambourine. So I've solved that with a little modern invention. The tambourine added a little flair for certain. Well, in the American camps on the way, you would have these fires, and they'd sing drinking songs. The guitar for this one. And the darker it got, the deeper they looked into the fire, the more they thought about their lot as soldiers. This was a British song, and we loved it, and we made it ours as well. So it was sung on both sides in the Revolution. Stands the glass around, for shame you take no care, my boys. Stands the glass around, let mirth and wine abound. The trumpets sound, the colors they are flying, boys, to fight, kill or wound. May we still be found content with our heart fare, my boys, and cold, hard ground. Why, soldiers, why should we be melancholy, boys? Why, soldiers, why, whose business 'tis to die? What sighing fire, drink on, drown fear, be jolly, boys, 'tis he, you or I, cold, hot, wet or dry. We're always bound to follow, boys, and scorn to fly. 'Tis but in vain, I mean not to upbraid you, boys. 'Tis but in vain for soldiers to complain. Should next campaign send us to him who made us, boys, we're free from pain. But should we remain, a bottle and kind landlady cures all again. Well, in mid-September, Washington and Rochambeau have arrived at Mount Vernon. And they are there to chart the Yorktown siege. And Martha was there, ready. Martha, the perfect hostess, even ready to entertain in the depths of wartime. It had been ever thus. She, in the very, very first winter of the war, she packed up her wagon and went on muddy roads to be at camp with Washington. And through the entire war, every fall, she made her way so that she could be there to present a Thanksgiving and a Christmas and to be at his side. In fact, Martha Washington was at George Washington's side for half of the Revolution. So we need a love song. And this is a song that had been a British song. We were always borrowing the best British tunes. It was called Saw You My Brother. And the tune was very popular. And after the Battle of Monmouth, we rewrote it. We imagined Martha ranging the plains of Monmouth, looking for George. We called it Saw You My Hero. Saw you my hero, saw you my hero, saw you my hero, I've arranged through all the plains. I've asked of every swain for some news of my hero George. I saw not your hero, saw not your hero, saw not your hero George. Your George is in the van of the battle just begun, and I to my men must away. Hark from the hills, the woodlands and deals, the drums and the trumpets' alarms. Ye gods, I give you charge of my gallant hero George, and return him unhurt to my arms. For George and Martha. By September 28th, George Washington, in command of 17,000 Allied French and American forces, began the siege at Yorktown. There were about 7,000 British troops. They resisted mightily, but they were completely surrounded. And after 3 weeks, including 5 days of non-stop bombardment day and night, Cornwallis surrendered October 17th, 1781, effectively ending the War for Independence. On October 19th, the surrender ceremony began at 2 p.m. The French lined up on one side of the road, the Americans lined up on the other side of the road, and the bedraggled British had to march through the center. They did so dejectedly that it was said their drums beat as if they did not care how. Our General Knox was giddy when he wrote his wife about the terms of surrender. They will not be permitted to unfurl their colors or play Yankee Doodle. Well, what did they play? They didn't, nobody wrote it down at the time. It was a slow air for sure. Didn't want anything sprightly, they weren't feeling sprightly. 30 years later, somebody wrote down that the tune they remembered, very appropriate, The World Turned Upside Down. Well, an American observed of this whole ceremony, it was evident to us that the English in their misfortune were especially mortified to be obliged to lay down their arms before Americans. For the British officers and soldiers, as they're marching through, affect to turn their heads towards the French line, ignoring the Lafayette perceived this and revenged himself in a very pleasant manner. He ordered the music of the light infantry to strike up Yankee Doodle, an air that the British applied to ridicule Americans at the beginning of the war, and which they uniformly sung to all their prisoners. This pleasantry of Lafayette was so bitter to the British that many of them broke their arms in a rage in grounding them. So they're British. Well, after the capture of Cornwallis, there were celebrations, thanksgivings, and dances throughout the land. Rochambeau gave a large dinner for the leading residents of Williamsburg, followed by a ball to which all the ladies in town were invited. And the American forces had to start moving north, but they stopped often enough to, as it says, the troops halted yesterday an hour to play a number of tunes on the fife and drum for some country girls. And dancing happened that same evening. What dances? Well, perhaps this popular tune. It had been a British dance tune. It was called King George's Minuet. We loved it. We said that title's gotta go. As soon as the revolution began, we called it Congress Minuet. So here is Congress Minuet and the Road to Lisdoonvarna. Well, within days of the victory, broadsides, you remember, the songs written about the news, broadsides were being peddled in the streets with this new delightful news. And this one is called The Surrender of Cornwallis. Appropriately, we put it to a British tune, just to get back at them again. Yes, this is what I need for this one. 'Twas the 19th of October in the year of 81. Cornwallis did surrender to General Washington. 6,000 British chosen troops marched out and grounded arms. Huzzah, ye bold Americans, for now sweet music charms. 6,000 chosen British troops to Washington resigned, besides some ships and Hessians that could not stay behind. The refugees and blackamoors, oh, what a direful crew. It was then he had some thousands, but now he's got but few. Here's a health to General Washington and his brave army too, and likewise to our worthy Green, to his brave honors due. May we subdue those English troops and clear the eastern shore, that we may live in peace, my boys, whilst war they are no more. Huzzah! Long life to our friends and confusion to our enemies. My favorite 18th century toast. Well, Washington and his men went north to wait it out because, yes, they had a victory at Yorktown, but the British still occupied New York City, and there were skirmishes all around here, and it did not feel over to George Washington. And so he was at Newburgh at his headquarters, and the men knew Windsor Cantonment. They built 600 log huts, and there were 7,000 troops at New Windsor. 7,000 men and one woman. Her name was Deborah Sampson. And she was a Massachusetts 19-year-old who had wanted nothing of woman's lot. So she dressed in man's array one day and joined the army. And she was so thrilled that she passed. She celebrated too much in a tavern that night and blew her cover. So it was back to the drawing board for Deborah. And she lay low for a few months, and then she dressed in man's array and went to a neighboring recruiting office and picked up the quill and signed in as Robert Shirtliff. And she was in the army now, and she served all around here. She was wounded in a skirmish in Tarrytown, and she nursed the wound herself so as not to be discovered. But then a fever came through camp, and a doctor reaching for Robert's heart made a discovery. He took her home to his wife. They nursed her back to health, keeping her secret, to such an extent that the doctor's niece fell in love with Robert. It got complicated. She finally had to write a note to the niece. It's just not going to work, signed, your own sex. And now it was out, and she was recovered, and she was honorably discharged from the army by General Knox at West Point as a woman. What a day that must have been, and a sight to see. She married, she had a couple of children. She toured and on stages in Boston, the Federal Theater, and others. She told of her exploits as a soldier in the war. And when she died, her husband sued and won a federal pension for her service as a soldier in the American Revolution. And she's not the first one. It's happened a lot. We know it from the old ballads that are about the cross-dressing that you had to go through. As I was a young maid about 17, I enlisted in the Navy for to serve my queen. Enlisted in the Navy, a sailor for to stand. Hear the cannons rattling and the music's so grand, and the music's so grand, and the music's so grand. But I hear the cannons rattling and the music's so grand. The officer who enlisted me was a fine and a gentle man. He says, you'll make a sailor, so come along, young man. My waist was neat and slender, my fingers neat and trim, and very soon they learned me. I soon exceeded them, I soon exceeded them, I soon exceeded them, and very soon they learned me. I soon exceeded them. They asked me to bunk, they asked me to bed, to lie with the sailors. I never was afraid, but in taking off my blue coat, sure it oftentimes made me smile. smile to think I was a sailor and a maiden all the while. A maiden all the while, a maiden all the while. But I think I was a sailor and a maiden all the while. Well, they sent me to London all for to guard the tower. I'm sure I would be there till my very dying hour. But a lady fell in love with me. I told her I was a maid. She went into my captain and my secret she betrayed. My secret she betrayed. My secret she betrayed. She went into my captain, my secret she betrayed. The captain, he came to me. He asked if it were so. I dare not, I dare not, I dare not say no. It's a pity we should lose you, such a sailor love you've been. It's a pity we should lose you, such a handsome young maid. You're a handsome young maid. You're a handsome young maid. It's a pity we should lose you, such a handsome young maid. Well, it's fare thee well, my captain. You've been so kind to me. Likewise to my messmates, I'm sorry to part with thee. But if ever the Navy needs a lad, a sailor I'll remain. I'll put on my cap and feather, I'll run the rigging again. I'll run the rigging again. I'll run the rigging again. I'll put on my cap and feather, I'll run the rigging again. Well, at last, on September 3rd, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed in Paris. So it took 2 months for the news to reach here. So it was on November 1st that Washington knew he had his victory. And it was time to march down the Hudson and take New York City back. And on November 25th, they did exactly that. And I have just the instrument to help us visualize these troops as they, lightness of step, know that they have won and they can come back to New York. This is a lumberjack. He's part toy, part instrument. And this is the tune that the soldiers on that day made up as they made their way south. Doodle, 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 dandy, cornstalk rum, homemade brandy, Indian pudding, pumpkin pie, that'll make the Yankees fly. And every Yank will have in his back a great big pumpkin in his sack. A little molasses and a piece of pork. Away the march straight for New York. Doodle, 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 dandy, cornstalk rum, homemade brandy, Indian pudding, pumpkin pie. That'll make the Yankees fly. Woo! Thank you so much. Yes. Well, as they marched in to the city, the British were just leaving. We had been accustomed for a long time to military display and all the finish and finery of garrison life. The British troops just leaving us were as if equipped for show, with scarlet uniforms and burnished arms, and they made a brilliant display. The troops that marched in, on the contrary, were ill-clad and weather-beaten and made a forlorn appearance. But then, they were our troops. And as I looked at them and thought upon all they had done and suffered for us, my heart and my eyes were full. And I admired and gloried in them the more because they were weather-beaten and forlorn. Weather-beaten, forlorn, ragged, half-naked, white, black, Native Americans, and the victors. And that march to victory, that march to Yorktown, started right here